Hello, and welcome back to Architecture Topics. I'm Liam Caron, and today we continue our special series on the New York World Trade Center. In our first episode, we looked at the rise of the Twin Towers and how they came to symbolize New York's ambition in the second half of the 20th century. In the second, we told the story of their fall on September 11th, 2001, a day of shock, confusion, and devastation. And now, in this third episode, we turn to what came next. When the dust settled, what remained was not just rubble. It was a void, a hole in the skyline, a hole in the city, and a hole in the lives of thousands of families. The question was immediate and impossible to give a right answer to. What should happen at Ground Zero? Should the site become a memorial? Should it be rebuilt as offices, as symbols of resilience? Could it be both? This episode will be about the long and difficult process of answering those questions. A process shaped not just by architects, but by developers, politicians, and the families of those who had lost their lives. It is a story of competing visions, of power struggles, and of compromise, one that unfolded over more than a decade and that still hasn't truly ended. Let's begin. In the months after September 11th, Ground Zero was a place of mourning. The fire smoldered for weeks. The wreckage was unstable, with twisted steel rising out of a mountain of debris. Workers searched tirelessly for remains, while families gathered at the edges of the site, leaving flowers, photographs, and letters. Clearing the site took 8 months. By May of 2002, the last steel beam was removed in a solemn ceremony. What remained was a vast empty pit, the bathtub we talked about in the first episode of this series, the foundation that had once held the Twin Towers. That absence itself became powerful. For many, it felt like the site should remain untouched, a memorial to what had been lost. But New York is not a city that sits still. Almost immediately, the debates began. Should the site be left empty and become a sacred space? Or should new towers rise as defiant symbols of resilience? The arguments weren't just architectural. They were emotional, political, and financial all at once. Families of victims, city officials, developers, and ordinary New Yorkers all had different visions of what Ground Zero should become. What united them was grief. What divided them was what to do with it. And on top of this, there was another layer, perhaps less visible, but ultimately decisive, which was, beyond all wishes and public opinion, who had the legal right to decide what happened there. At the center was the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. They owned the land, so they needed to prove that Lower Manhattan could recover and thrive again. Their concern was as much political and symbolic as it was financial. Then there was Larry Silverstein, a developer who had signed a 99-year lease on the World Trade Center just weeks before the attacks. He pushed to rebuild quickly. His priority was commercial. He needed buildings that could attract tenants, satisfy insurers, and turn a profit. The political voices were equally strong. Governor George Pataki of New York and Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and later Mayor Michael Bloomberg, all saw Ground Zero as tied to their legacies. Each wanted a say, and each had a different vision of what rebuilding should symbolize. And in the end, nothing could move forward without their support. And then there were the families of the victims. For them, the site was sacred ground. Many argued that the footprints of the Twin Towers should never be built on again. All of these groups wanted something different. Ground Zero was not just a construction site. It was a battlefield of competing agendas, each pulling the future of Lower Manhattan in a different direction. To try and coordinate all these voices, a new body had been created, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, or LMDC, Set up by Governor George Pataki and Mayor Rudy Giuliani just weeks after the attacks, and chaired by John Whitehead, a former Goldman Sachs executive, the LMDC was tasked with overseeing the rebuilding of Lower Manhattan. So in 2002, the LMDC hired the New York firm Beyer Blinder Bell to produce an initial master plan. What they presented was a set of 6 towers surrounding a central plaza. They were practical. They restored the lost floor space, and they were engineered to be safe. But to the public, they were crushingly disappointing. These towers could have been built anywhere. They didn't speak to grief or resilience or New York's identity. Critics called them generic, uninspired, even banal. Newspaper editorials attacked them, and public meetings filled with anger. It quickly became clear that simply replacing rentable offices would not be enough. The public wanted architecture that rose to the gravity of the site. Something ambitious, symbolic, and worthy of ground zero. Faced with such intense criticism, the LMDC shifted course. Instead of moving ahead with Beyer Blinder Bell's plan, they launched an international competition that invited some of the world's leading architects to imagine what ground zero could become. The competition drew enormous attention. Ground Zero was not just another project. In the eyes of the world, it was the most important architectural commission of its time. By December 2002, thousands of entries had been submitted. From there, the LMDC had curated a short list of heavyweight firms, including Norman Foster, Richard Meier, SOM, and Daniel Libeskind. Libeskind's proposal, called Memory Foundations, quickly stood out. He was already known for powerful symbolic projects like the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and his Ground Zero plan struck a similar chord. The footprints of the original Twin Towers would remain as memorial space. A sunken plaza would align with the sun on each anniversary of September 11th. And above it all, a tower with a spire would rise to 1,776 feet, tying the new Skyline to the year of American independence. In February 2003, Libeskind was declared the winner. His design captured the imagination of the public and the press, and for a moment, it felt as though Ground Zero had found its vision. But the victory was only symbolic. The LMDC could declare a winner, but like we saw earlier, they did not have the legal right to decide. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey owned the land, and their priority was revenue and usable office space. And with a 99-year contract on the property, the leaseholder, Larry Silverstein, could not be ignored either. He had the power to block any project that didn't align with his interest for almost a century. For both the Port Authority and Silverstein, Libeskind's plan seemed too symbolic, too impractical, and too expensive. Silverstein, in particular, wanted his own architect, David Childs, a partner at SOM, to design the new towers. So while Libeskind had won the competition, the actual power sat with the Port Authority and Silverstein. And almost immediately, Libeskind's vision began to fall apart. Instead of bringing clarity, the competition brought tension. Libeskind was asked to collaborate with Childs on what would become the tallest building, the Freedom Tower, later renamed One World Trade Center, while other architects were invited to design the rest of the towers. That partnership was tense from the start. Libeskind pushed for symbolism and light, while Childs prioritized engineering, safety, and lease requirements. Meetings turned into battles. Libeskind sketched spires and gestures toward memory, while Childs redrew plans to satisfy tenants and regulators. The Port Authority often sided with Childs. And of course, Silverstein did too. And this was just the main tower. Other architects were also drawn in. Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, and Fumihiko Maki were each commissioned to design separate towers within the complex. But even their work was caught in the same push and pull. Ambitious designs were proposed, reworked, delayed, or shelved entirely. The result was that Libeskind's Memory Foundations plan became more a framework than a blueprint. The symbolic gestures remained: the preserved footprints, the memorial space, the idea of a spire, but the details were steadily rewritten by the forces of economics, politics, and safety regulations. Ground Zero was being rebuilt, but not in the way the competition had promised. While the towers and office space stirred battles between developers and architects, another process was unfolding in parallel: the memorial. In 2003, a separate competition was launched for the 9/11 memorial itself. This one was open to the public, and it drew over 5,000 submissions from around the world. The winning design came from Michael Arad, a relatively unknown architect at the time, working with landscape architect Peter Walker. Their proposal was called Reflecting Absence. It envisioned two vast square voids set in the footprints of the original Twin Towers. Water would cascade down their walls into endless pools, while the names of every victim would be inscribed in bronze around the edges. The sound of the waterfalls was designed to muffle the sounds of the city, creating a space for quiet reflection. Where the towers had once risen into the sky, the design marked their absence instead. Families of victims strongly supported it, and politically, it offered a way forward. The footprints of the towers would be preserved as sacred ground, while the surrounding site could be developed commercially. It was a compromise. Part memorial, part office park. But in that compromise, the future of Ground Zero took shape. The memorial would honor the past, while the new towers would point toward the future. With the memorial plan in place and new towers slowly taking shape on paper, the next step was construction. The first sign of progress came in 2006, when 7 World Trade Center was completed. This building sit just to the north of the complex, technically outside the new master plan, but it became a symbol that rebuilding was possible. The larger site, however, moved much more slowly. The tallest tower went through years of redesigns as Libeskind's symbolic spire gave way to David Childs' more pragmatic form. By the time it opened in 2014 as One World Trade Center, it was still 1,776 feet tall, but the details bore little resemblance to the winning competition entry. Other towers faced similar struggles. Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, and Fumihiko Maki all delivered designs, but deadlines slipped, projects were delayed, and decisions were reversed altogether. The most notorious case came when Norman Foster's tower, which had been approved in 2006, was replaced by a new design from Bjarke Ingels Group in 2015. Foster's design had been official for 9 years, and then got replaced overnight, largely to suit prospective tenants like 21st Century Fox and News Corp. These tenants later pulled out, leaving the site in a limbo that still lasts to this day. The transportation hub, designed by Santiago Calatrava, became another saga of delays and soaring costs. What was meant to cost under $2 billion and be built in 5 years ended up costing nearly $4 billion and taking 12 years to complete, finally opening in 2016. Ground Zero was being rebuilt, yes, but only after more than a decade of conflict, compromise, and delay, shaped by grief, ambition, money, and politics, all colliding on a single stage. So, after all this back and forth, what really stands on Ground Zero today? Well, at the heart of the site is One World Trade Center, designed by David Childs of SOM. Rising to 1,776 feet, it is the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. It was born from Daniel Libeskind's idea of a symbolic spire, but its final form came through Childs. It opened in 2014. 2 World Trade Center was originally commissioned to Norman Foster, who designed a tower capped with a diamond-shaped roof. But as you now know, It was later replaced by a new design from Bjarke Ingels Group. Even today, Tower 2 remains a hole in the skyline. 3 World Trade Center, designed by Richard Rogers, opened in 2018 with its striking steel braces across the facade in typical Rogers style. 4 World Trade Center, a minimalist glass tower reflecting the memorial pools below by Fumihiko Maki, opened in 2013. 5 World Trade Center, after years of uncertainty, is now rising as a residential tower, with Kohn Pedersen Fox as its architect. And as I mentioned earlier, the rebuilt 7 World Trade Center, also designed by David Childs, was actually the first to be completed back in 2006, standing slightly apart from the main site and symbolizing the beginning of renewal. Other than the towers, the site hosts the National September 11th Memorial, the 2 massive holes on the ground where the towers once rose, designed by Michael Arad and landscape architect Peter Walker. Beneath the plaza lies the 9/11 Museum, designed by Davis Brody Bond. Although the most recognizable part of the museum is the entrance pavilion, which was designed by Norwegian firm Snohetta. It opened in 2014. And then there is the transit hub, the Oculus, designed by Santiago Calatrava. Its white rib-like structure opened in 2016 and has become one of the most striking additions to the site. Finally, just to the south of the site, across Liberty Street, sits Liberty Park, a small elevated plaza overlooking the memorial. Within it stands the rebuilt St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church, also redesigned by Calatrava, a glowing Byzantine-inspired form that now serves both as a church and a quiet place of reflection. So, the site today is no single vision. It is a mix of memorial and commerce, of ambition and compromise. A place where towers rise again, but where the absence of what was lost is marked forever. It is at once a business district and a memorial, a tourist destination and a place of mourning. It is proof that New York could rebuild, but also a reminder that some voids can never be filled. And that brings us to the end of today's episode, the third on this special series about the New York World Trade Center. In the next episode, we'll turn our attention to the centerpiece of this rebuilt site, the One World Trade Center, the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, and one of the most symbolic towers of our time. I'm Liam Caron, and I'll see you next week. Until then, keep looking up.